For 30 years, my grandfather kept an old, dark, unremarkable-looking painting in his front hallway and called it, whenever anyone asked, worthless junk his own father left him. It hung there so long it stopped being a painting at all, in any real sense, and became simply part of the house. The way old houses accumulate things nobody actually looks at twice, things you'd walk past 1,000 times without your eyes ever once actually landing on them. I couldn't have told you, before all of this started, what was even depicted on it. Some kind of dim harbor scene, I think. A few boats. Nobody in my family had looked closely enough in 3 decades to remember it more precisely than that. He died in March, at 86, after a short illness that gave us just enough warning to say goodbye properly, which I've since understood is a kind of mercy not every family gets. I remember the week of the funeral mostly in fragments. The specific gray light through the funeral home's windows, my mother's controlled, exhausted voice thanking a long line of people who'd known him decades longer than most of us grandchildren had, my Uncle Gerald standing near the front the entire service with the particular stillness of a man determined to look composed in front of an audience. The will was straightforward in almost every respect. The house and savings split evenly between my mother and my Uncle Gerald, small keepsakes distributed among the 4 grandchildren, the kind of tidy, uncontroversial arrangement you'd expect from a careful, orderly man who'd clearly thought it through in advance. Except for one line, near the end, that named me specifically, and only me, as the sole beneficiary of the harbor painting in the front hallway, along with a short, handwritten note, folded separately inside the same envelope, that read simply, "Get it properly looked at before you decide anything. Don't let anyone rush you. Grandpa." I remember the lawyer reading that line aloud in his small, quiet office, and the specific brief silence that followed it. My mother's raised eyebrows, my cousin's barely suppressed laugh at the idea of anyone fighting over that ugly old boat painting. And if I'm honest, only in hindsight do I remember Gerald's silence in that moment as being a different, heavier kind of silence than everyone else's. I want to be honest that my first reaction was mild confusion rather than suspicion. It seemed like an odd, sentimental gesture from an old man, leaving his favorite grandchild a piece of junk he'd apparently held on to for 30 years out of some private attachment nobody else understood, along with an oddly formal instruction to get it looked at, as though he wanted to give the moment a little ceremony it probably didn't deserve. I put the note in a drawer, and I would have let the whole thing sit there indefinitely, exactly the way my grandfather himself had let it sit unexamined in a hallway for 3 decades, if my Uncle Gerald hadn't done something that changed my mind within 4 days of the funeral. Gerald called me on a Thursday, less than a week after we'd buried his own father, and told me, with a warmth that felt, even at the time, slightly rehearsed, that he had a friend in the art business who'd always had a soft spot for that old harbor painting, and who was willing, as a favor to the family, to take it off my hands quickly for a decent sum. Enough, Gerald pointed out, to cover a car repair or a nice vacation. Framed the way you'd frame doing someone an unglamorous favor. He suggested I could sign the painting over to this friend that same week, before the estate's other paperwork even fully cleared, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that it would honestly be one less thing to deal with during an already difficult time. I told him I want to think about it. He called back 2 more times that same week, each time a little more insistent, each time finding a new small reason the timeline mattered. The second call, he mentioned his friend was particularly interested this month, and that art buyer's interest could be unpredictable. By the third call, 4 days later, the tone had shifted slightly. Less favor, more gentle urgency, reminding me that these old paintings could deteriorate if they're not properly cared for. A claim that struck me, even before I knew anything else, as a strange thing to suddenly worry about after 30 years of the painting hanging unbothered in a hallway. He also, in that third call, named a specific number for the first time, an amount that sounded, on its own, reasonably generous to someone with no context, but that I would later learn was barely a fraction of what an honest appraisal would eventually reveal. I want you to notice, the way I eventually noticed, exactly how much quiet urgency was packed into those 3 phone calls over 1 short week. My grandfather had been dead less than 7 days. The estate wasn't even formally settled, and my uncle was already pushing, gently but persistently, to move a specific object out of the family, to a specific buyer he'd apparently already lined up, for an amount that felt, the more I sat with it, strangely low for something he was in such a hurry to secure. That was what finally sent me to my grandfather's note, instead of Gerald's phone calls. If the painting was genuinely worthless, I remember thinking, standing in my kitchen with both offers in front of me, there was no reason on earth for anyone to be in this much of a hurry to acquire it. I found an independent appraiser myself, deliberately not the family friend Gerald had suggested, a careful woman named Dr. Petrov, who specialized in maritime and harbor paintings from exactly the period this piece appeared to be from. I brought the painting to her office 3 weeks after the funeral, expecting, honestly, still mostly expecting her to confirm what my entire family had believed for 30 years. I remember sitting in her small, cluttered office, watching her work, the specific quality of concentration in her face as she moved a raking light slowly across the canvas surface, checking something in the brushwork under magnification, occasionally making a short note in a leather book without saying anything at all, for what felt like an unbearably long time. She spent almost 2 hours examining it, under different lighting, checking the canvas and frame construction, before she finally set down her tools, looked up at me, and said, in the careful, measured voice of someone about to say something she wanted to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as excitement, that she believed, pending further authentication, that this was very likely a genuine, previously unrecorded work by a moderately significant regional harbor painter from the early 20th century, an artist whose confirmed works, she told me, had sold at auction in recent years for amounts that made my stomach drop when she said the range out loud. I remember asking her to repeat the number, certain I'd misheard the first time. She hadn't misspoken. I asked her, once I'd recovered enough to speak, whether this was the kind of thing that could have simply gone unnoticed for 30 years by an ordinary family with no reason to suspect it. She said it happened more often than people assumed. Misattributed or simply unexamined regional works sitting in unremarkable homes was, apparently, not nearly as rare as popular imagination suggested. But she also mentioned something that snagged in my mind immediately, almost in passing, delivered in the same neutral, professional tone she'd used for everything else. She said the painting's condition and cleaning history suggested it had actually been formally appraised at some point in the past, likely within the last 15 to 20 years, based on the specific type of protective backing that had been added to the frame, a kind of backing that isn't something a family typically adds on their own without a professional's involvement. I want you to sit with that detail the way I had to sit with it, because it's the moment this stopped being a story about a lucky discovery and became a story about something much colder. If a professional had touched this painting within the last 2 decades, someone in my family had almost certainly known, at some point, that it wasn't simply worthless junk. And the only person who'd been in any position to arrange something like that. My grandfather had lived alone for the last 12 years of his life, rarely left the house, and had neither the money nor, frankly, the inclination for professional art conservation, was someone who had access to the house, an interest in the painting, and, as I was about to discover, a very specific reason to want any real appraisal to stay quiet. I went back to Gerald's friend, the art dealer he'd been pushing me toward, not to sell, but to ask a few careful questions under the guise of simply gathering more opinions before I decided anything. His gallery was smaller than I expected, tucked above a framing shop, and Foster himself, a smooth, mildly irritated man who clearly hadn't expected to be questioned rather than simply handed a painting, spent the first 10 minutes of our conversation trying, with practiced ease, to steer me gently back towards simply signing the paperwork Gerald had apparently already prepared. When I pushed, asking specifically what he thought the piece was actually worth, he gave a vague, dismissive answer about sentimental value, only, mostly, delivered with the smooth confidence of a man who'd clearly given some version of that exact sentence before. It was in the middle of that same reassuring speech that he let slip the detail that changed everything. A specific reference to the backing we added years ago to protect it during transport. A sentence he seemed to realize, a half-second too late, he probably shouldn't have said to someone who hadn't yet told him any appraisal had ever taken place at all. I watched his face do a small, involuntary thing right after he said it, a flicker of recalculation, and he tried, clumsily, to walk the comment back into something vaguer, but it was already too late. I thanked him for his time and left before he could ask me anything else, my hands not quite steady on the steering wheel of my own car in the parking lot afterward. I confronted Gerald 3 days later at his own kitchen table with Dr. Petrov's preliminary findings in a folder in front of me. I remember rehearsing exactly how I'd opened the conversation the entire drive over, and abandoning all of it the moment I actually sat down across from him, opting instead to simply slide the folder across the table and watch his face as he read it. I watched something in his face shift, fast, from wounded confusion to a kind of resigned, calculating stillness, the specific expression of a man deciding, in real time, how much of the truth was still salvageable to deny. "I don't know what you think you found," he started, and I let him get almost a full minute into a version of the story where he was simply a helpful son trying to make an already hard week easier for everyone, before I told him, calmly, about Foster's slip regarding the backing, a detail he had no way of knowing I'd caught, and one that visibly landed harder than anything in Dr. Petrov's folder had. He stopped mid-sentence. He was quiet for what felt like a very long time, staring at his own hands on the table, before he said, in a much smaller voice than he'd used for any of the phone calls, "You weren't supposed to talk to Foster directly." What eventually came out, over the following hour, in pieces, half admissions, and long silences, was this. Gerald had, in fact, arranged a private appraisal 15 years earlier, quietly, without telling my grandfather what the informal opinion actually was. He'd framed it to his own father, at the time, as simply having a friend take a look, just out of curiosity, and had then, according to what he eventually admitted, simply never mentioned that Foster's informal assessment had come back suggesting real, significant value. Instead, he and Foster had spent the following 15 years quietly, patiently waiting, checking in on the painting's condition periodically under the same cover story of harmless curiosity, positioning Foster as the family's trusted, ready buyer for the eventual day my grandfather either agreed to sell or passed away, counting, the whole time, on the painting's reputation as worthless junk, remaining exactly as unquestioned as it had been for the previous 15 years before that. I asked him, at one point, whether he'd ever once considered simply telling his own father the truth. He didn't answer that question at all. He just looked at the table. What I hadn't expected, and what genuinely surprised me more than the scheme itself, was learning that my grandfather had, in fact, figured out at least part of it years before he died. Gerald told me, with a bitterness that made clear he hadn't planned on this detail ever coming out, that about 6 years earlier, my grandfather had found paperwork in Gerald's car, accidentally, going through it looking for a phone charger, referencing an old appraisal inquiry with Foster's gallery, paperwork that predated any conversation Gerald had ever had with him about selling. My grandfather never confronted Gerald directly about it. According to Gerald's own account, delivered with real, uncomfortable resentment at having apparently been quietly watched and evaluated by his own father for 6 full years without ever knowing it. Instead, my grandfather had simply, quietly changed his will the following month to name me, specifically, as the painting's sole heir, along with a note asking me not to let anyone rush me. A note, I understood now, that wasn't sentimental at all. It was a direct, deliberate countermeasure against exactly the kind of pressure Gerald had, right on schedule, applied within days of the funeral. I want to be honest about how strange it was to realize my grandfather had built that safeguard 6 years in advance, quietly watching his own son's slow-motion scheme unfold from a position of apparent ignorance the entire time, never confronting him, simply, patiently, rerouting the one thing Gerald actually wanted toward the one person he correctly guessed wouldn't be easily rushed into signing it away. I don't think my grandfather ever intended for the full scheme to come out this cleanly, or this publicly, within his own family. I think he mostly just wanted the painting itself protected. The rest, Gerald's forged story about sentimental value only, Foster's slip about the backing, the full 15-year timeline, I found entirely on my own, following a trail my grandfather had only ever meant to nudge me toward the very start of. I had Dr. Petrov complete a full, formal authentication over the following 2 months, a process that involved a second independent expert, laboratory analysis of the pigments and canvas, and a nervous 6-week wait for results that felt, by the end of it, longer than the entire 30 years the painting had spent quietly ignored in that hallway. The painting was confirmed, with reasonable confidence, as an authentic, previously unrecorded work, and I made the decision, once that was settled, to sell it through a legitimate, competitive auction process rather than to foster at any price. A decision that ultimately returned an amount many times what Gerald's generous favor had originally offered, enough that even Dr. Petrov, who I imagine had seen plenty of these outcomes before, told me afterward it was one of the more satisfying resolutions she'd been part of in years. I split a portion of the proceeds with my mother, who'd had no idea any of this was happening and was, I think, more hurt by her own brother's 15 years of quiet scheming than by the money itself. She told me, the day I explained the whole timeline to her, that she kept turning over one particular detail in her mind. Not the money, not even the forged story, but the 6 years her father had apparently spent quietly watching his own son, knowing what he knew, and never once saying a word about it to anyone, carrying that private disappointment completely alone rather than let it fracture the family while he was still alive to see the fracture happen. Gerald and I have not spoken since the kitchen table conversation. I understand from my mother that he's told a version of events to the rest of the extended family in which he was simply trying to help handle things efficiently after Dad's death, a version that conveniently omits the 15-year timeline and the paperwork my grandfather found in his car. I don't feel any particular need to correct that story loudly. The painting sold at public auction, with full documentation, in a way that speaks for itself to anyone who eventually looks closely enough. It's raining tonight. The way it was raining the week, I first sat in my kitchen with 2 mismatched offers in front of me and a strange, formal note from a dead man asking me not to be rushed. I kept a single, careful photograph of the painting before it left for auction, and I have a frame now in my own hallway, in almost exactly the spot it used to hang in his. Not because I need the reminder of what it turned out to be worth, but because I've come to understand that the actual inheritance here was never really the painting at all. It was a 6-year silence, patiently maintained by an old man who'd caught his own son quietly betraying him and decided, instead of confrontation, to simply, carefully make sure the betrayal couldn't finish what started. I think about my grandfather differently now than I did the day of his funeral, when he was, to me, mostly just a kind, quiet old man who liked boats and never talked much about his own feelings. I understand now that he spent the last several years of his life carrying a specific private grief about his own son that none of the rest of us ever saw, choosing, deliberately, not to let that grief curdle into a public confrontation that would have fractured the family while he was still around to watch it happen. That kind of restraint, I've come to think, is its own quiet form of love. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind anyone throws a parade for, but the kind that simply, patiently, makes sure the people you're protecting never have to know how close they came to being hurt. My grandfather called that painting worthless for 30 years. I've come to believe he knew exactly what it was worth for at least the last 6 of them, and that the real value he was protecting, in the end, was never really about money at all. It was making sure the last thing he owned that anyone actually wanted couldn't be quietly taken from a family that trusted the wrong person to be honest about it.